If you've never built, launched, and grown a no-code app before, especially one on Bubble, one of your concerns may be scalability. Are no-code tools like Bubble scalable, and can you build well-performing apps? You've probably wondered, as your app grows, either with features or users, maybe database size or volume of work it does, will it continue to perform well, and will it scale right alongside your business as a whole? The only real answer is it depends. You can build a really poorly performing and unscalable app on Bubble, just like you can build a really well-performing and scalable app. And the reality is, most of this has very little to do with Bubble itself at its core, and it more so depends on your own development strategies, frameworks, and best practices. And in this video, we're going to go through 6 specific strategies you can use to make sure you are building the most scalable app possible on Bubble so that your app can grow and your business as a whole can grow too. This video is going to be broken up into a few different phases. We're first going to start with some development methodology. And the reason for this is because these scalability strategies are relevant to different phases of your development. So you need to know when to deploy them at the right times. The second thing we're going to go over are those strategies and frameworks that are going to help you build a scalable app. And then the last thing is, make sure you stick around until the end, because we actually have a full scalability guide that's going to walk you through building a scalable and well-performing app on Bubble. And you can download that to couple it with this video and make sure you're building the best app possible. So stick around until the end for that. Hey, it's Kristen, co-founder at Coaching No Code Apps. We help non-technical entrepreneurs build custom apps to start their app-based businesses or grow their existing businesses all without coding. And if that's what you're doing, then subscribe to this channel for new videos to help you every single week. Okay, let's look at some development methodology to start. Now, there's a specific order in which we want you to build your app, and this is essentially to make sure you're building the app in the most efficient ways possible, and so that you don't have to backtrack or jump around in your development. So in looking at the iPad here, we have 3 phases of development. The first phase is your database structure. So the first thing you want to build with your app is the structure of your database for the first version of your app. Your app will evolve over time and your database will evolve over time. Once you have that, you then want to focus more on the front end. Now, this is where most people start, so we're switching this around here. But if you have your database structured, then that's going to inform how you're going to create the front end designs of your app. So let's say you're building a form. Well, if you have your database structure already there, then you already really have kind of like an outline for what you need to put into the front end of the form, because you're going to need certain inputs to bring in certain data. Okay, so now that's just a really small example, but if you consider that, then you can see how the database can inform a lot of the rest of your development. And then you'll focus on the workflows or the logic, the things that connect the two of these. So you have your back end, you have your front end, and then you just go and you connect them. Okay, so this is the order in which you want to build your app and your features. Getting a little bit more granular, you also want to think about a user's journey through your app. So you might be thinking, well, do I create my entire database and then my entire front end of the app and then all the workflows after that? Well, yes and no. Here's what I mean. Let's say a user's journey through your app looks like this. Over here we have the start, which is like their registration, their onboarding, their login. Over here is where we have the finish, which is when they achieve the goal of the app. Now, an app is not generally a one-use thing, so there can be one start and then many finishes, but just think about the journey your user will take through your app as a whole to achieve the overarching goal of the app. Well, you have your database structure for the app as a whole, you have your page structure for your app as a whole, and then you have all of your other features that kind of go within those. And so you're going to focus on database structure and then front end or page structure at first. And then once you start building these individual features that take a user from start to finish, you'll go through that development cycle, right, for every single feature. Okay, now that might mean tweaking the database a little bit, tweaking the front end a little bit, and creating the specific workflows after having already created the overarching foundation for your database structure, the overarching foundation for your page structure. And you'll kind of continue like that as you go. Okay, now this is not a specific order that you have to follow for your entire development, but this is the methodology you want to follow in general to create efficient development that keeps you from jumping around all over the place and backtracking and kind of just creating a cluttered workflow for yourself. Now that you have an understanding of that, we have these 3 phases, and the scalability best practices and frameworks we will talk about will apply to different phases within this. And then at the end here, we have one more kind of 4th phase, which is really when you're tying everything up. So you're preparing to launch the app. And some of the other strategies that we'll go through apply to this section as well. So we're going to look at your database, your front end, your workflows, and kind of those pre-launch wrap-up things and how different strategies for scalability can apply to each one of these steps as you go. Okay, so let's dive into these 6 development strategies to build that scalable app. So the very first one is building an efficient database structure. The key to an efficient database structure is balancing the weight of your database records. You don't want the size of each record to be so large that it potentially slows down pages, but you also don't want to split things up so much that it overcomplicates your logic. With this in mind, we have 4 rules of thumb to help you create this balance within your own app. Number 1, in general, it's better to have more data types with fewer fields than fewer data types with more fields. Number 2, don't use list fields if you anticipate a single record to have over 100 items in that list. Number 3, use option sets for contained lists of choices that don't change often, max out around 12 to 25 items, and have under 10 custom attributes. And number 4, create dynamic structures wherever possible. For example, instead of creating a survey data type with fixed fields for each question, create separate types for questions and answers and link them to the parent submission. This allows for an unlimited number of questions. If we go back to this model that we looked at before, this best practice applies to this first phase, right? Your database structure. Now, of course, these things aren't necessarily plug and play, so you can't copy and paste these directly into your app, and that's because every app is different. And so what is going to make one person's database structure efficient would not be the same for another person. But if you keep these best practices in mind, when you are creating your database, it'll help you create the efficiency that you're looking for. All right, so we're gonna step away from the first step of that 3-phase development methodology and look at the second step, which is the front end of your app. These next strategies that we're going to talk through apply to creating a reliable design for your app as a whole. The first point in relation to designs that we'll talk through is the use of repeating group elements. So think about how your app is going to be presented to a user. And sometimes when you're building your app in development, you might test it yourself and see that things perform well, meaning when you're acting as a user, things seem to work how they should. But once users come on board, things can quickly change. So think about using repeating group elements. Let's say you're going to be displaying a list of 50 different things or 100 different things to users. Okay, so you have a long list of data that your users are going to be sifting through. Now, if you have 50 data points or 100 data points that you're going to be displaying, when you're testing the app, if you only have a few results show up in that list, then it's going to load just fine and your app is going to seem to perform well. But once you have users on board and maybe that list turns into 100 items instead of those 5 or 10 that you tested with, well, then things can slow down a lot. And so if you're going to have long lists showing for users in a repeating group, then instead of showing everything at once on one page and having really slow loading times, actually break that up so that you might show a list of 10 results or maybe even just 5 results, and you can implement pagination where you show only a limited number of results on the first page, and then the user can click through to the second page, the third page, the fourth page, and see the rest of the results. Now, this helps speed your app up a lot because it's not loading every single result all at once, and it's going to make a much more enjoyable user experience on the front end. Number 2, be careful with adding search expressions to nested repeating group cells, as the number of searches happening at once can add up very quickly. So again, going back to repeating groups because they're so commonly used, make sure you keep this in mind as well for reliable performance. Point number 3, be mindful of when and where you're triggering API calls that receive a lot of data. Use conditions to make the calls only when needed. This is really important if you're going to be using APIs in your app at any point. The next point is to use reusable elements in your designs wherever it's appropriate. So anywhere you find that you might be designing something multiple times, use a reusable element instead. That way you can create that design only once and then use it in multiple places throughout your app. That will help you not have to update all of those things individually every time you do go and push updates, and instead have one reusable element to control. That's going to create a much more scalable workspace and a cleaner experience for your users. As a quick aside, there is performance and there is perceived performance. Performance is how well your app performs. Perceived performance is how well users think your app performs. Now, for some things within your app, there is just no way to make it faster or smoother. With some things, they're just going to take a certain amount of time, and that's kind of all there is to it. But that doesn't mean you can't make it feel faster to the user. A really simple example of this are loading pages that you see on almost every app or website you use. When something is loading, an image or an animation or a loading cog will kind of spin, or there might be a progress bar. And that's because things always feel faster when you think you're making progress. Another best practice when it comes to reliable designs is to use styles within your app. So I'm in the bubble editor here inside the styles tab. And essentially when you are designing your app, instead of creating a new design for every single element that you use or design you create, you can set styles in your bubble app, and that's going to help your app perform better. So when you use styles, if you look at these styles right here, they're things like body light 18, body light testimonial, and these are different styles that are used throughout the app. So anytime we need to use we're creating a testimonial, well, we want all of those to look the exact same, so we can use this style instead of going in and, if we go and add 5 new client testimonials to our site, instead of going in and formatting all of the text to look the exact same on each individual one, well, we can create a style in the app once and then apply that style to each of those elements. It's actually faster for Bubble to load styles once than it is for Bubble to load each individually styled element on your pages. So use styles for better performance in your app. Another best practice is to leverage backend workflows wherever there's potential for mass database changes, looping, or particularly heavy actions. This is better for the app and the user's experience. The next point is to be mindful that any operation starting with a colon will happen at the browser level. So try to filter down data searches as much as possible within the primary search constraints window first. Also be mindful of consolidating identical workflow sequences into custom events. And the last one we'll talk through is to consolidate your data sources wherever possible with custom states and element sources. This reduces error and amount of searching in your app. Okay, so we've talked about the database phase, we've talked about the front-end phase, and we've actually already touched on that number 3, workflows or logic, or kind of the in-between phase. So let's go a little bit deeper into that middle part, what goes on behind the scenes with your app. The efficiency of your database structure and how you create those designs have a lot to do with the scalability and performance, but we also want to think about third-party services or integrations. You want to balance your app's integrations, and what that means is when you're using third-party services or you're using plugins to add on custom functionality to your app, make sure that you are balancing the use of those while keeping scalability and performance in mind, because they very much affect that. Right now I'm on the Bubble plugins marketplace page. So you can use lots of different plugins on Bubble. And if there's not a plugin for what you need, if there's a third-party service that you want to use to add certain functionality to your app, then you can connect to that service if it offers an API. The thing to understand as it relates to scalability is every time you use a third-party service or you use a plugin, you are creating kind of like a micro dependency for your app. So if you're connecting to a third-party service via API, then you are now partially dependent on that third-party service to also be well-performing. And if you are connecting to a third-party service and using a plugin, you're adding another dependency on top of that, because now you're dependent on the plugin being well-performing and scalable and the plugin being maintained. And so every time you add these dependencies onto your app, you risk your app's overall scalability and performance long-term. The key here is to prioritize building your features yourself using Bubble's native elements, because it keeps you in control over element and workflow customizations and leads to a more consistent app compared to a mashup of plugins, for example. Now, if you do need to connect to third-party services, then instead of defaulting to plugins, default to using APIs instead. You can use the API connector to create these integrations, and while that is a little bit more advanced, it reduces those micro dependencies for your app. Now, there are a handful of other best practices when it comes to plugins and integrations. We're not going to do a deep dive into those here. We actually have an entire video talking about that, so definitely check that out once you're finished with this video so that you can make sure you're staying in control of those integrations and plugins you're using. Before moving into that 4th phase of our development methodology, we're going to look at one more thing, which is reliable security for your app. Now, if you're interested in learning more about security as a whole and how you can control it, we also have a video on that, so check that out after this video, after the plugins video, so you can take a deeper dive into security on Bubble, but we'll do an overview here so you can understand how it relates to the scalability and performance of your app. By the way, if you're finding this video helpful, if you could give it a like down below, we would so greatly appreciate it. It helps us just help more people build and launch scalable custom apps. Remember, we talked about perceived performance. Now, security has to do with performance and perceived performance, because if a user comes onto your app and they don't feel it is reliable and secure, then it's probably not going to feel like it's performing very well. So you always want to make sure that your app feels secure and, of course, is secure for your users, and that they only have access to the right information. So let's jump into a few best practices as it relates to security. First thing is to keep your app as private as possible in the general security settings, so only you and collaborators can access the editor. On top of that, define a strong password policy to discourage user account hacking, and importantly, create privacy rules in your app to give access to certain users versus taking away or limiting access. Use the everyone else default as the restricted access rule. The next thing is to limit access to your backend workflows, and wherever applicable, generate API keys for third parties connecting to your app's API. On top of that, use password check workflows before running any important database changes. And finally, research your own industry's compliance needs if you have to follow certain regulations. It's always imperative for you to do that before you risk coming up against any issues down the road. This is something that you'll know whether or not it applies to you pretty much right off the bat. Let's go through 2 more best practices for creating a scalable and well-performing Bubble app. The next one we're going to talk about is thorough testing. Now, this one might seem a little bit simple and like it doesn't really have anything to do with scalability, but the reality is testing has more to do with your app's performance and scalability than pretty much anything else. If you're not testing, you're creating blind spots and your app may struggle to scale. Bubble has a number of different testing tools to help you test and troubleshoot your app, and we're gonna throw them up on the screen here right now so we can walk through them. Number 1 is the debugger tool, which contains an element and workflow inspector. Make sure you use this, and whenever you're previewing your app's pages, don't remove it. Get out of that habit if it's something that you formed and use your debugger. The second thing is the app search tool, which helps you find all uses of elements, fields, and actions, and it can really streamline and speed up your testing. The next one after that is your server logs, which track your app's workflow activity. After that, we have the issue checker, which reveals incorrect setups in your workflows and designs. And lastly, you actually have different preview modes, so you can isolate conflicts coming from plugins or from custom code, for example. Oftentimes, you go through development and you put so much work in that you think whenever your features are finished being developed, your app is ready to go, and then when you run into lots of testing and troubleshooting issues, it can feel like a little bit defeating sometimes and like a whole other project in and of itself. So the best thing you can do is approach development with a development and testing are equals mindset, because when you do that, it's going to leave you room and energy and brain space to thoroughly test your app and make sure it's performing as well as it possibly can for your future users. Going back to our model here, we're now at number 4, the testing best practices we went over. Obviously, those apply to the first developmental phases, but that 4th phase that we added on is more about making sure that your app is as scalable and well-performing as possible as you actually go through your launch and put it into users' hands. And with that in mind, we're going to talk about organized version control. Version control is a critical part of development that helps you manage and track changes. As you scale your Bubble app to more users or features or data, it's important to be strategic in your timing and frequency of deployments. Otherwise, you may risk losing data or publishing updates too soon and giving users a poor experience. A few best practices to keep in mind to help you stay organized. Number 1 is to document your deployments with really clear notes and timestamps so that if you have to revert, it's easy for you to do so. Remember, perceived performance is a really big thing, and if you don't stay organized with your version control, then you can give users a really poor experience, which makes them feel like your app is not performing well. So stay organized with this. The second thing is to deploy during off hours as much as possible to avoid interrupting your users' experience. You can install a visitor tracker, something as simple as Google Analytics, to find out what your off hours are. And keep in mind, they might not be obvious. Off hours to you might mean the middle of the night, but your middle of the night might not be your user's middle of the night. Next is to deploy on a consistent schedule to avoid too many impulse deployments. You want to allow time to address unexpected bugs as a result of deployment, and having a routine will help you prioritize your changes. On top of that, use save points before introducing major changes. And lastly, test your deployed changes in a live environment. Obviously, this is a lot to keep in mind, and I don't want to overwhelm you with this information, but I do want to equip you with the right strategies and best practices so that you can create the most scalable app possible. So the next thing you need to do is head to coachingnocodeapps.com/bubble-scalability. The link is also down in the description below, and grab the full scalability guide. You can download it yourself. And the reason to have the guide is to make sure you have all this information on hand right in front of you as you are building your app. Because what we don't want to happen is for you to build your app and unknowingly build things incorrectly and in unscalable ways, and then have to rebuild once you bring your users on board. This is our entire focus day in and out. We help our clients every single day avoid that problem. The big focus is on building a scalable core of your app, and these are some of the best practices that go into that. Keep in mind, these aren't all plug and play. You can't just copy and paste them. But if you take this mindset and you keep these perspectives throughout development, it's going to help you tremendously. So head to coachingnocodeapps.com/bubble-scalability, grab your copy of the Scalability Guide, and build a better performing app because of it. I hope this was helpful. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.